In 2004, I was a Merrill Fellow at Harvard Divinity School, and I was auditing a course under Dr. Diana Eck on world religions. And she had a guest speaker, the Venerable Lama Migmar, and he said this: "To move forward in our practice, we seek to move from the intellect to faith. We grow from blind faith towards wisdom faith." The body of 19-year-old Black Lives Matter activist and aspiring artist and model Toyin Salou was found earlier this month in Florida. She'd been living in a church shelter and had accepted a ride from a man to get back to the church where she could collect her belongings. She later tweeted that she had been sexually assaulted by that man, and before she lost connection with the outside world, she explained to her friends that she had trusted the Holy Spirit to protect her. So now, obviously there's an evil rapist and murderer to blame for her death. You might also mention her carelessness, and you could probably dig up some culpability on the part of her family of origin. But I want to ask this: was the church that encouraged her to put her faith in the protection of the Holy Spirit, was a church that assured her that an all-powerful, all-seeing God was watching over her, does that church share some responsibility in having set this girl up to be murdered? Isn't there such a thing as theological malpractice? Is bad religion an accessory to a crime, especially one like this? We have about 50,000 suicides in America every year now. Disproportionately, by a factor of 4, gay teens and gay people in their 20s commit suicide 4 times more than other people. And you have to ask yourself, why would that be? Why would people in the very beginning of their lives be so much more likely to kill themselves? It will come as no surprise to you to know that multiple studies have shown that the religious condemnation of homosexuality is a major factor, because the religious convictions of people like our current vice president fuel a prejudice that not only tells mothers and fathers to reject and exile their own sons and daughters, but it causes young gay people to despise themselves and in hopelessness often take their own lives. Is it then too much for me to say that evangelical, Orthodox, Catholic churches literally cause the deaths of tens of thousands of young, talented, intelligent people who just happen to be gay? If you tell a gay person that if they ever actually have sex, that they will go to hell forever, is that really morally much different than handing them a loaded gun and telling them that death is preferable to falling in love? Can the church be held harmless when there is literally an annual tidal wave of suicides of young gay people? I was a grad student doing my clinicals and counseling right here in Bowling Green when a former nun limped into my office, the bruised face, broken ribs, injuries all over her body, which she told her employer. She was a nurse at the local hospital. She told her employer that she had fallen down the stairs. Again, she fell down the stairs a lot. She told me that her priest had told her that this abuse at the hands of her alcoholic husband was her cross to bear. It was the consequence of having broken her vow in the convent to have lived a life of celibacy and prayer. And I got to tell you, it's a story I've heard repeated many times through years of pastoral counseling and volunteering in spouse abuse shelters. Pentecostals, evangelicals, Catholics, and sometimes even mainstream pastors will counsel women to forgive their husbands and try again, to try to change the husband's abusive behaviors by being more obedient, less argumentative, and of course, more sexually compliant. Now, we liberals want to be accepting, we want to be unjudging, tolerant, freedom-loving people. We want to say that everyone is free to choose their own spiritual path, their own religious beliefs, practices. But I have to ask you, is there a point at which our tolerance becomes tacit approval? Can we, by being unjudging, telegraph the kind of acceptance that says that misogyny and homophobia are just personal choices, to such a degree that we who are trying to be open-minded liberals also become accomplices to domestic violence, to suicide, and sometimes even murder? I believe that it's inescapable to conclude that bad religion is at least a contributing factor, and in some cases, directly responsible for these and many other grave social ills. You may not agree with me, but like one of my professors always liked to say, this is just my opinion. It just so happens that I'm right. Now, I don't have any tattoos, maybe I should say yet, but if I did, it would surely be this quote from Voltaire. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Traditional religious teachings limber people up to deny science, to ignore research, to ignore facts, even men and women to ignore their own experiences. There have been times in history when it seemed like we were about to emerge from that darkness of magical religious thinking. The French Revolution, the emergence of modern science in the West, even movements which have sought to preserve the community building and values education of religion without all of the magic and superstition. In 1822, Thomas Jefferson said, "There is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian." It appeared at that time that traditional religion was going the way of all flesh, and that people might preserve the community building and the ethical thinking of their faith communities without all of the magic and superstition. You could point to the writings of Thomas Paine, many others from the early days of the United States, who seemed to be ready to dismiss all the supernatural theism and to embrace a religious perspective that was rooted entirely in ethics, a study in morality. But the institutional church has always managed to drag the majority back into creedal and ritualized religious practices. The United States has been through 3 major waves of revivalism: the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and then the revivals that took place right around the end of World War II. All of these have drugged people back into church attendance and sort of cementing, as it were, a literal wall between academic theological thinking and the actual practices of the people in the pews. That wonderful group of scholars who started the Jesus Seminar in the 1980s gave a concerted effort to breaking down that wall, to get academics inside church buildings. That movement made Marcus Borg, John Shelby Spong, Karen Armstrong, and John Dominic Crossan famous people. But even the millions of their amazing books failed to put much of a dent in the wall of ignorance and magical thinking that defends the traditional religious expressions of faith. The numbers of people who are still engaged in traditional churches has been in rapid decline, other than the mega churches, which seem to defy that social trend. But it remains to be seen to what degree the current pandemic might affect how many of even those larger churches will be surviving at the end of this decade. Our congregation in Springfield, Missouri started in 2008 to serve those who were sufficiently liberal and progressive to be a bad fit in any mainstream church of our area. And we did grow for a while. We made it almost to the point of being able to have Sunday school classes and youth groups, and we even went on mission trips. We had a lot of social events, but about 5 years into our experiment, our attendance at our bricks and mortar church, what we call our seated congregation, started to decline, but interest in the content of our church grew online. By the time the pandemic hit, we were down to having about 40 people in our Sunday service, but our sermons were being downloaded more than 15,000 times a month. So for the past several years, I have been predicting the demise of seated congregations and the growth of online faith groups. When the pandemic hit, we simply took another step. It wasn't that different for us. We just took another step in the direction of becoming an online church. Some of the churches in our area are making what I personally believe to be a very dangerous and irresponsible decision, that they are reopening their services to the public. But I don't think many of their folks are finding their way back into the pews. Most congregations are typically older, and until there's a vaccine, the majority of those who used to go to church are not likely to do so again, even when there is a vaccine, if that vaccine is anything less than 100% effective. Most churches will end up having to close, but a few will make the successful transition into becoming online churches. But realistically, how many options do you need for online congregations? Right now, there's over 400,000 churches in America. There's not going to be 400,000 online churches. You might only need 100 or 200 different choices, and most of the rest of them will fail. I strongly suspect that a year from now, half of the churches in America will be closed. But as devastating as the pandemic will be on churches, it really isn't doing anything that wasn't happening already. It is accelerating it, but it was happening anyway. While the demise of superstition-based religious beliefs has been mistakenly announced many times in the last 300 years, I'm willing to go out on a limb and place my bets one more time that it's about to go the way of all flesh. I think that all forms of pie-in-the-sky religion will be going the way of the Flat Earth Society. People who go to traditional churches will be in the same group of people who still set up cameras around Scotland's Loch Ness in hopes of photographing a long extinct dinosaur when it crops its head above the water. And I've been to Loch Ness recently, and there are still photographers out there. Civilizations don't change quickly, but I believe that the churches that are rooted in a belief in heaven and hell and an imaginary friend who lives in the clouds, who authored very questionable books in the distant past, I think that church is going away. I'm not certain that any churches will survive, but the ones that might, the ones that will still be here 10 years from now, the ones that will be more than just an online church, will be the ones that foster meaningful community, that provide service opportunities, which address the real world issues that confront us in this rapidly changing world. As I always do when I'm invited to speak to a church for the first time, and I think since 40 years have passed since I was here last, this is the first time. I want to try to sum up what it is that I've been trying to say in my books, in my videos, in my classes, in my newspaper columns. In sum, it is this. Our pre-modern ancestors tended to interpret natural events by personifying nature, assuming that invisible spirits with human emotions cause the events of nature and physics. And depending upon where they were, geography and language, some of these beliefs coalesced into a formal religion. In 2020, it should be clear that while these ancient beliefs often convey helpful insights that can help us to understand our lives and to be better people, we really must stop acting like angels and demons are real, that there is a heaven and hell, that anyone has an imaginary friend who lives in the clouds, and that you have a soul because you're a person, but apes and chickens and lichen and daisies do not. The great mystery of the universe that some call God did not write the Bible, didn't write the Quran, didn't write the Upanishads. No matter how special Jesus or Zoroaster may have been in history, they were certainly no more divine than you and I are. So please, let's all get our heads out of the clouds and take a look around us. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and we still don't have universal health care. We are a century and a half past slavery, and yet we still have this racial apartheid that is as cruel as slavery ever dreamed of being. In fact, we have managed in the last 30 years to resegregate our schools. Schools are less integrated now than they were when I graduated from high school. We get distracted by momentary news cycles while thousands of children, I hate to break it to you, but they're still living in unsanitary and cruel circumstances, locked into cages on our borders. Just because the pandemic and news about police brutality have taken over the narrative doesn't mean that those children have ever been reunited with their parents. We've just stopped talking about it. We currently have labor-saving technology and the ability to generate all of the power we need. There's enough wind in Wyoming, enough sunlight in Arizona, that with the right infrastructure, we would never need to burn another gallon of gas or another lump of coal. We have the natural resources to build all the housing we need. We have the available labor and space to grow all of the food that we need and to do so sustainably. But we don't do it because, as I mentioned earlier, it is just as Voltaire said, those who can convince you to believe in absurdities can convince you to commit atrocities. So we continue to poison our own planet for temporary financial gain while keeping the majority of people in the world locked into the violence of racism and poverty. Hunger only exists in our world because we have not organized in a civilized way to distribute food without consideration for profit. A mere 3% reallocation of our military budget could wipe out hunger around the world. And why that is not a sermon in every church, synagogue, and mosque in the world is beyond me. I'm getting old. I have to tell you, I'm getting tired of liberals because we will intellectually get to a point where we give up on communion, but then we start burning sage and acting like we've done something of great significance. Many of my peers know a lot about essential oils, but they don't know that we've got 2 million Americans in jails and prisons and 7 million on parole, all of whom are virtually locked out of having a decent job for the rest of their lives. We can have a spiritual life that is rooted in ethics and which builds human connection and fosters peace and love, but what I see among most of institutional religion is a kind of creedal paranoia that passes racism and classism from one generation to the next and the next. Couldn't we just all decide today that we're going to stop that crap? Just stop it? If churches are to survive into the 21st century, we're going to have to find a good reason to survive. You can't say that we're not desperately needed. I think that we are. But we're not needed as havens for racism and sexual prejudice. We're not needed to foster superstition and magical thinking. We are needed to face the real moral challenges of creating a just and fair world that is now home to 4 billion people. Journalists in our age have become an endangered species. The print media is nearly dead, and the 24-hour TV news channels don't know the difference between news and commentary. They have more propaganda than they have information. Social networks, what used to be the fraternities and sororities in which people found meaningful relationships, are all falling apart. They're being replaced with social media, with Facebook, with Snapchat, which is 10 miles wide and 1/4 of an inch deep. If churches are to survive, they need to seize their potential of becoming places where people can become informed, where they can be inspired, where they can be motivated, and dare I say it, be organized for action. Churches can be places where your 500 Facebook friends become 10 or 12 actual friendships. You know, people who would mow your lawn for you if you had a broken leg, make soup for you when you're on chemotherapy, or even give a damn if a member of your family dies. I have over 5,000 people on my Emerging Church Facebook page. I have 15,000 listeners to my sermons. I have over 1,000 friends on my personal Facebook page, and not a one of them would come and walk my dog for me if I needed to be out of town for a couple of days. I'm mad about that, and I don't even have a dog. Now, I look forward to meeting your congregation in person next summer, but here's my hope for you. I hope that your church is personally significant to each of your members individually. I hope each of you are finding connection to others within your church. But collectively, I hope that your church is morally relevant on a global basis. Now, loneliness is the single largest form of suffering in America today. A spiritual congregation should be the cure to loneliness. There should be meaningful friendships that arise out of every church. But globally, I hope that your church will be a part of the solution to racism, the cure for poverty, the transformation to sustainable energy, construction, agriculture. I hope that your church is a voice for Black Lives Matter and for the brown children in dog cages on our southern border. I hope that you advocate for prison reform, reform of the militarization of our police forces, and that you will fight against an economic system that keeps shifting all of our capital resources into the hands of the 1% while impoverishing the majority. Now, I don't think you should ever tell anybody who to vote for or who not to vote for, but I think that your church ought to be able to teach everyone not to ever vote for a racist or a homophobe or a xenophobe, or a classist, or for that matter, an Islamophobe, certainly not a misogynist. And please don't make me add spray-on orange tanner to that list, because that could cost me my tax-exempt status. The future needs us if we are relevant. Now, I look forward to seeing you next summer. But between now and then, let me ask you, in the words of Bruce Cockburn, to keep kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. Thanks.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.